I did it! I actually did it. I have beaten Sifu, and wow, it was quite the challenge, especially for going in rather blind. The game started out by impressing me with its pleasing visuals and slick combat, but definitely took me on an emotional roller coaster that rewarded me for seeing it through. Sifu is all about mastering its gameplay mechanics to the point of truly earning the title of Sifu. On a personal level, I love martial arts. I've always enjoyed the over-the-top combat in old kung fu films and anime, as well as appreciating and practicing the practical application of techniques in the real world. I came into this experience with some background knowledge of several of the inspirations that this game draws from, but am by no means an expert. The gameplay is definitely the star of the show here, offering most players a push and pull of challenge and satisfaction. Early on, before the game dives too deep into the combat mechanics, we are introduced to the series of events that set up this classic kung fu narrative. Sifu is a classic kung fu tale of revenge. There really isn't much to spoil here in regards to the story, but there are always those who want to go in completely blind, which to those of you who that applies to, I'd say come back to this video once you've finished the game. With that out of the way, to put it bluntly, the Sifu of your kung fu school is murdered, as are you, the playable protagonist. However, through the unknown magical properties of a charm, you are brought back to life with one thing on mind: revenge. After 8 years of non-stop training, you as a martial arts master seek to find the 5 fighters responsible for your Sifu's death to bring them to justice. Of course, during this quest, there are a variety of locations and a ton of combat encounters along the way. As a whole, Sifu's simple story serves as a great vehicle to take you on the adventure that it does. Throughout the non-stop action, details about your Sifu's murder are discovered. Through the use of a whiteboard, clues and information are added to paint a broader picture that feels somewhat detective-esque. From drug-infested hideouts to a conceptual art exhibit and even a self-help sanctuary, there is a lot to see and experience. A complaint I do have about the story is the lack of insight to your nameless hero. While we learn of the game world through the perspective of the nameless protagonists, little to nothing is learned about them outside of the basics established in the intro. This may have been the goal of the developers, with the story mainly serving to set up the non-stop action, but I do think this classic revenge formula could have been explored to a greater degree on a character level. From a gameplay perspective, Sifu serves as a semi-linear beat-em-up, or at least that's how I would describe it. The narrative guides you down a variety of sets and scenarios that you must fight your way through to advance. The game threw me in rather quickly, which I personally liked, but I definitely missed a lot of the nuanced details explained early on. Surviving is definitely a priority here, but as you progress, you do discover that surviving is just not enough. You must master the movements and techniques if you want any hope of defeating all 5 stages. On the surface level, Sifu's combat mechanics may draw comparisons to games like Spider-Man for PlayStation or any of the Arkham games, with its use of light and heavy attack complemented by a slick finisher. Everything is set up by solid foundations in dodging, blocking, parrying, and sometimes evading. Put simply, you're not going to get very far without these building blocks. There is definitely an ideal time for each of these approaches in defense, with dodging being my main go-to for its generous timing window. Blocking is fairly straightforward, but can only be used so many times in a row, which took me a few deaths to understand. Parrying is super effective in taking out enemies as quick as possible. If there is a game that Sifu's combat reminds me of, it would actually have to be Ghost of Tsushima, with its emphasis on timing and positioning. Like in Ghost and some of those other games mentioned earlier, there are both light and heavy attacks. Heavy blows tend to be unsurprisingly more effective, but can be a tad slow at times to land. As you gain experience and die, combos become obtainable upgrades to the player, which serve as a nice way to break up possible feelings of repetitiveness. As someone who hates over-the-top, illogical fighting game combos, I can happily report that most of the special moves here don't require more than 3 or 4 presses. Once you've gotten an opponent's health low enough, you can perform an artistically violent finisher. Along your journey, you'll find many weapons in the traditional sense, as well as some a little more unconventional. Everything in your environment is a factor, whether it's an object you throw or your relationship to space. crowd management becomes a real relevant skill here in breaking down your opponents in the most efficient manner. I'd often pick off the weaker enemies to allow myself to give the stronger opponents my full attention. Another strategy I often adopted was mixing up my targets mid-combo. This was a good method to address multiple enemies in the event that I got surrounded. In Sifu, your strategy to combat is just as important as your technical execution. The combat here is fairly unforgiving compared to most games, so when you do find the right balance of timing, defense, and aggression, it is an amazing feeling. Early on, it's easy to assume Sifu is all about reflexes and reaction time, but it's actually very dependent on rhythm. Besides combat, the big feature unique to Sifu is the mechanic of resurrection, where once you die, you come back to life at the price of age. You start your quest for revenge at the young, durable age of 20, but will quickly find yourself into your 60s with far less health while dealing moderately more damage. It doesn't sound like that bad of a trade-off until you realize whatever age you finish one section at carries over to the next. For example, if you're like me and you finish the first level at the ripe old age of 62, then it becomes very apparent that you need to go back and beat it in order to have enough lives for the rest of the game. When it comes to the aging process, the more often you die, the greater the age increase will be. So if you hardly ever die, then when you do, chances are you'll only be going up 1 or 2 years, compared to consecutive deaths that compound on top of each other rather quickly. Once you do die in your 70s, it's game over, but luckily you can carry over some of your upgrades to the next attempt if done right. This is one of the areas of the game that isn't clearly presented early on, but becomes rather important to the overall game strategy. Should I learn this specific move for this upcoming encounter, or should I permanently learn this less useful technique before I become too old? Eventually, once you do make your way through a level, you are greeted with a boss. Each of these bosses are challenging in their own right with a unique skill set that is not seen anywhere else in the game. While none of them were easy, I, like many others, personally struggled with the second boss, Sean, the most, with at least 15 deaths. By the time I finished the game, I actually found him to be one of the easiest opponents, once I was able to absorb his patterns as muscle memory, but this leads me to the topic of difficulty. I personally lean towards the side of accessibility, which is often in the form of difficulty settings, but I can definitely understand the argument for preserving the creator's intended experience. As of this recording, however, it does sound like Sloclap is planning on adding difficulty settings. Kind of a mixed bag, but one thing I do feel strongly about is in the training mode, or lack thereof. If the game is going to ask players to master the mechanics to the point of perfection and don't want to include the checkpoint system as well as difficulty settings, then we need a way better training system. As of right now, your dummy opponent is only capable of being passive or aggressive. Passive mode is basically a punching bag to try out new moves with no resistance. Change the setting to aggressive and the dummy will begin to pursue you. But the problem here is that the shallow moveset won't prepare you for the majority of enemies. I'm not saying we need to have a setting to emulate the bosses to a T, but I think a large variety of the enemy types and other settings could have really gone a long way. Once you do beat each of the challenging stages, you have the option to streamline it all over again, with a caveat in order to actually roll credits. While not a showstopper, Sifu does excel in the presentation department with strong art direction and an abundance of style. There isn't much in the way of texture detail to let you know that you're playing the game in 4K on PS5 and PlayStation 4 Pro, but that isn't a bad thing. The base PS4 version runs at a solid 1080p with little differences in visual quality. I did notice some visual hiccups and at times pop-in, with the biggest difference between the two versions being loading time. The PS5 version of the game does utilize haptic feedback in subtle ways, but you aren't missing out on much without it. Most importantly, both versions of the game run at a mostly smooth 60 frames per second. To those of you interested, here is a quick comparison if you want to see how these versions compare. The high frame rate count mixes well with the variety of animations that flow together nicely. While not perfect, most animations smoothly lead into another, making combat feel fluid and dynamic. This dynamism is a huge aspect to what makes the gameplay so addictive. You get to watch combat encounters as if it was a kung fu movie, but you get to experience it on another level behind the controller. Sifu in many ways is a love letter to classic kung fu films, proudly wearing its influences on its sleeves. There were several films I immediately noticed references to or inspiration from, like Old Boy, Lady Snowblood, Fist of Fury, Ip Man, and various Jackie Chan movies, but I'm sure there's a ton I'm missing. A die-hard classic or modern kung fu enthusiast may be able to nitpick some of the things missing and inspiration, but from an outsider's perspective, I think Sloclap nails it, finding a good balance of paying respect to its variety of source material while carving out its own identity. A huge attribute to the success of the presentation is due to the exceptional and colorful soundtrack. Each beat really excels at adding to the atmosphere and tension of each level, with my personal favorite being the club. As a package, the presentation and inspiration of Sifu mixes and blends together effortlessly. Sifu offers up a simple but compelling narrative faithful to the genre of films that the game takes inspiration from. The presentational elements of the game all work together to give you a real sense of immersion in the environment and combat. While not for those faint of heart, Sifu offers a rewarding and satisfying challenge for all of those who choose to embark on the journey. 9 out of 10. If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a like, and I'd like to hear from you down below. As always, I appreciate you for watching, and until next time, see ya!